Some families shaped history in ways almost hard to believe. A banker's house in Florence sparked the Renaissance. A marriage pact in Vienna created an empire. A Russian dynasty ruled 1/6 of the earth. And a family of bankers quietly financed wars and kings without wearing a crown. These are the quiet stories of powerful families that shaped our world. Every time I sit down to share one of these stories, I wonder where you might be listening from. Maybe it's late at night. Maybe the sun's just beginning to rise. Wherever you are, let the room get quiet. Find a spot that feels easy to rest in, and we'll wander gently into tonight's story together. When you picture Florence during the 15th century, you might imagine narrow cobblestone streets, arching bridges crossing the Arno River, and towers that pierced the Tuscan sky. In those winding lanes, amidst the hum of markets and the echo of church bells, the Medici family rose quietly at first, then firmly, weaving themselves into nearly every corner of European history. They were not born as kings or dukes, nor did they inherit a throne. Instead, they began as bankers, merchants of money, who understood the subtle currents of trust, credit, and calculation. In an age when coins often clinked louder than swords, their fortune and skill allowed them to move beyond mere finance into politics, religion, and even art. It is soothing to reflect on how a family, starting with something as abstract as lending and counting, could shape the very face of Renaissance culture. The Medici Bank, established in the late 14th century by Giovanni di Medici, did not appear grand at first glance. A banking house in those days was not like the marble-fronted institutions you might see centuries later. Instead, it was often a modest building, filled with tables where clerks recorded numbers in careful slanting script. Merchants and rulers alike came to deposit their money or to arrange loans. Giovanni's genius lay in building relationships that stretched beyond Florence, branching into Rome, Venice, London, and Bruges. These were not simply financial outposts. They were lifelines of influence, binding together distant courts and merchants into a network that pulsed with Medici wealth. You might imagine the steady scratching of quills on parchment as clerks tallied accounts, each stroke of ink subtly increasing the reach of the family. Giovanni's son, Cosimo de' Medici, sometimes called Cosimo the Elder, inherited not only the banking empire, but also the vision of how to use wealth as a stepping stone to something more enduring: power. He lived in Florence, where noble families often clashed, where political factions could erupt into sudden violence, and where exile was always a looming threat. Rather than relying on force, Cosimo preferred quiet influence, offering loans to allies, arranging advantageous marriages, and funding projects that made Florence itself shine. When you walk today through the Uffizi or gaze up at the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, you are in many ways seeing the Medici strategy made solid in stone and pigment. Their wealth was not hoarded in vaults, but poured into buildings, churches, and works of art that reminded citizens, gently but persistently, who made such wonders possible. The relationship between the Medici and art is perhaps their most famous legacy. Artists like Filippo Brunelleschi, who designed the vast dome of Florence's cathedral, or Donatello, whose sculptures breathed life into marble, relied on Medici patronage. Later, names like Botticelli and Michelangelo would also flourish under their gaze. Patronage in those days was not simply generosity, it was a form of political communication. By supporting artists, the Medici cultivated a city that radiated culture and sophistication, while quietly ensuring that their own likenesses, symbols, and ideals were woven into the very fabric of beauty. You might picture Botticelli's Primavera, delicate figures gliding across a painted garden, knowing that without Medici support, such visions might never have reached canvas. But behind the elegance of art, there was always the murmur of politics. Florence in the 15th century was technically a republic, yet in practice the Medici maneuvered themselves into a position where little could be decided without them. Cosimo understood the value of subtlety. Rather than declaring himself ruler, he held no official title beyond the ordinary offices that rotated among citizens. Yet he became the quiet center of the Florentine world. Decisions passed through him, rivals often found themselves indebted to him, and opponents discovered how swiftly exile could follow disagreement. It was power wrapped in invisibility, influence without a throne, and it made Florence unusually stable in an era when Italian city-states often erupted in turmoil. Cosimo's successors carried on this balance between openness and control, but it was his grandson, Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, who gave the family an almost mythical aura. Lorenzo lived in Florence, bursting with colour, song, and intellectual vigour. He himself was a poet, writing verses that flowed as smoothly as the Arno beneath the city's bridges. He hosted gatherings where scholars discussed ancient texts, newly rediscovered from dusty monastic libraries, reviving the philosophy and science of Greece and Rome. Under Lorenzo's eye, Florence became the beating heart of the Renaissance, a city where one could stroll from a workshop filled with half-finished canvases to a garden where philosophers debated under lemon trees. It was a vision of life enriched not only by wealth, but by the idea that beauty, learning, and creativity could lift the human spirit. Yet the Medici story was never without shadows. Their wealth invited envy, and their dominance sparked conspiracies. One of the most infamous was the Pazzi conspiracy of 1478, when rival bankers, allied with the powerful Pazzi family, attempted to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano during a church service. Giuliano was killed, but Lorenzo escaped with his life. The scene, blood upon sacred marble, remains etched into Florentine memory. In the aftermath, the Medici responded with ruthless efficiency, executing conspirators and reinforcing their control. The incident reminds us how fragile power could be, even for families who seemed untouchable. You might imagine the heavy silence in Florence after the bells tolled for Giuliano, as citizens weighed the danger of challenging the Medici again. Beyond Florence, the Medici extended their reach into the highest levels of European politics and religion. Through careful marriages and alliances, their descendants would eventually sit upon the thrones of France, becoming queens and shaping dynasties far beyond Italy. Even the papacy did not remain untouched. Popes Leo X and Clement VII were both Medici, transforming the family's influence into something truly continental. Consider for a moment how remarkable this was. A banking family, not originally of noble birth, had risen to become arbiters of both secular and spiritual power. When you imagine the grandeur of the Vatican during Leo X's reign, with Raphael painting his frescoes and choirs echoing in St. Peter's, you are also hearing the echo of Florentine banking halls. One of the curious aspects of the Medici legacy lies in how they helped preserve and transmit knowledge. During the Renaissance, ancient manuscripts from Greece and Rome were often fragile, scattered, and in danger of vanishing forever. The Medici sponsored the collection, translation, and study of these works, creating libraries where scholars could pore over Plato and Aristotle, Cicero and Galen. The Medici Library, still in Florence today, is a monument to this effort. You might picture a scholar hunched under candlelight, carefully copying a manuscript, each letter a fragile bridge between antiquity and the modern world. Without such efforts, much of the philosophical and scientific revival of the Renaissance might have been muted or delayed by centuries. The Medici's fortunes, however, rose and fell with the unpredictability of politics. Their banking empire, once the envy of Europe, eventually collapsed under poor management and mounting debts. For a time the family was even exiled from Florence, their palaces abandoned and their enemies triumphant. Yet, time and circumstance often turned in their favour. They returned, reshaped their strategies, and even gained noble titles, eventually becoming the Grand Dukes of Tuscany in the 16th century. From humble bankers to dukes, their journey demonstrates how adaptable and resilient the family truly was. You might reflect on how in history, power often favours those who can change their form, like water adjusting to the shape of its vessel. Even their decline, centuries later, carries a sense of quiet inevitability rather than abrupt collapse. By the 18th century, the Medici line dwindled, leaving no heirs to carry on the name, yet their imprint had already sunk too deep into the soil of Europe to vanish. The art, the architecture, the libraries, the political precedents, all of these lived on, carried forward by others who inherited what the Medici had fostered. Walking through Florence today, with tourists gazing upward at frescoes or pausing on stone bridges, one can still sense the Medici presence lingering, not in the form of banners or armies, but in the cultural atmosphere of the city itself. To truly understand the Medici, it helps to picture Florence itself in their era. Unlike the vast capitals of empires, Florence was a compact city, cradled in the valley of the Arno and surrounded by Tuscan hills that rippled in shades of olive green and golden brown. Vineyards stretched outward, and groves of cypress trees stood like dark sentinels against the sky. The climate was temperate, marked by mild winters and warm summers, creating fertile conditions not only for crops but for trade and human gathering. A city of perhaps 40,000 to 60,000 people, it was large for its time, yet small enough that news travelled quickly and alliances could be sealed with a handshake across a marketplace stall. In such an environment, a family with careful planning could rise to prominence far faster than in the sprawling courts of France or the distant reaches of the Ottoman Empire. Daily life in Florence offered constant reminders of both opportunity and danger. Narrow streets bustled with vendors selling cloth, spices, and simple foods like bread, olive oil, and salted fish. The air carried a mixture of smells: freshly baked loaves, animal hides from tanneries, and the faint metallic tang of iron from smithies. Families lived close together, often above their shops, their windows draped with cloth to keep out dust. In the evenings, lamps flickered in the squares, and music sometimes drifted from taverns. But beneath this ordinary rhythm lay a sharp awareness of factional divides. Wealthy merchant families carried grudges that could flare suddenly, and guilds competed for influence. For the Medici, success meant learning to read these currents as carefully as their ledgers. One might imagine Giovanni di Bicci, the founder of their banking house, rising early, dressed in simple but well-made wool, and walking to his offices near the bustling centre. He was known not for ostentation but for restraint, a man who preferred to let others display their wealth while he quietly accumulated power. His demeanour set the tone for the Medici style: cautious, strategic, and always aware that wealth was most useful when it was invisible. Giovanni avoided drawing envy, even while building one of the most formidable financial networks in Europe. His lessons on modesty and calculation would echo through generations of his descendants, who often remembered that survival in Florence depended as much on perception as on actual strength. Cosimo de' Medici expanded on these principles. While Giovanni had laid the groundwork, Cosimo understood how to weave finance into the very fabric of politics. He lived at a time when Florence's government was a delicate balancing act. Officially, power was shared among citizens through rotating councils and offices, but in practice, families with wealth could guide decisions behind the scenes. Cosimo excelled at this game, lending money to allies, placing friends in positions of authority, and quietly ensuring that his opponents struggled to gain footing. To those outside the city, Florence might have appeared stable, but to insiders, it was clear that the Medici hand rested gently, yet firmly on the scales. The family's home life also reflected their evolving status. Medici palaces were not only residences but symbols of influence. The Palazzo Medici Riccardi, designed by Michelozzo for Cosimo, stood as one of the earliest Renaissance palaces in Florence. Its design balanced strength and elegance. Rusticated stone on the lower levels suggested fortification, while graceful arches and orderly windows above hinted at refinement. Inside, courtyards filled with light gave space for gatherings, and chapels adorned with frescoes blended devotion with display. You might imagine guests entering the courtyard, hearing the echo of footsteps on stone, and recognizing immediately that they had stepped into the domain of Florence's quiet rulers. The Medici were not alone in seeking power. Rival families like the Albizzi and the Pazzi also vied for dominance, and their competition shaped the city's politics. The Albizzi, once strong adversaries, were eventually outmaneuvered by Cosimo, who spent time in exile before returning triumphantly. The Pazzi, as mentioned earlier, plotted with even greater boldness, daring to strike within a sacred church. These rivalries were not abstract conflicts but real struggles that played out in public squares, in whispered meetings, and in the daily loyalties of guilds and artisans. A shopkeeper might quietly favour one family over another, and a stonemason might find himself drawn into political tension simply by his employer's choice of patron. The city's very stones seem to echo with the rivalries of its elite. In art, the Medici's role becomes most vivid. They supported not only the great masters, but also countless smaller workshops where apprentices ground pigments, carved wood, or practiced sketching from classical statues. For every Botticelli or Leonardo, there were dozens of artisans whose names never survived, but whose skills contributed to the flourishing culture. The Medici encouraged this ecosystem, sometimes funding entire projects that employed hundreds. Consider Brunelleschi's dome. Beyond the architect himself, the work required masons, carpenters, engineers, and labourers who devised new machines to lift stones. By financing such endeavours, the Medici did not merely create beauty, but also stimulated innovation in technology and craftsmanship. Florence's universities and intellectual circles also benefited. The Medici helped found the Platonic Academy, where scholars translated and debated classical works. Figures such as Marsilio Ficino, who translated Plato into Latin, found steady support from Lorenzo de' Medici. These intellectual pursuits gave Florence a sense of purpose beyond commerce. You might imagine scholars gathering in gardens, their robes brushing against gravel paths, while they read aloud from newly recovered manuscripts. The rediscovery of Plato or Aristotle was not just an academic exercise, but an attempt to rethink the nature of humanity, ethics, and the universe. The Medici ensured that Florence was not only a place of wealth, but a cradle of ideas. Religious devotion also intertwined with Medici influence. Their patronage of churches was not limited to aesthetics, it reinforced their role as protectors of the faith. The family funded chapels, altars, and entire basilicas, ensuring their presence in sacred spaces. The Medici Chapel within San Lorenzo is an enduring example, where art and faith combined to enshrine the family's memory. The act of commissioning such works was both a spiritual gesture and a political one. Worshippers, glancing upward at stained glass or frescoes, were subtly reminded of the family that made such beauty possible. In this way, the Medici secured loyalty not just through money or politics, but through the very rituals of daily worship. When the family's influence extended into the papacy, this intertwining reached its height. Pope Leo X, once Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici, used his papal office to further the family's power while also indulging in lavish displays of Renaissance culture. His reign coincided with Martin Luther's protests, meaning that the Medici papacy was at the center of one of Europe's greatest religious upheavals. Clement VII, another Medici pope, faced the storm of the Reformation as well as the brutal sack of Rome in 1527. These crises revealed that even Medici influence had limits. Wealth and connections could not always shield against the sweeping tides of history. Still, their presence in the papacy demonstrates how fully they had embedded themselves into Europe's highest institutions. The Medici women also played important roles, often through marriage alliances. Caterina de' Medici, who became Queen of France in the 16th century, carried Florentine traditions into the French court. She introduced culinary and cultural refinements, and her political maneuvering shaped the French wars of religion. In her, one sees how the family's influence stretched beyond borders, affecting not just Florence or Italy, but the fate of entire nations. Through her descendants, the Medici bloodline coursed through European royalty, subtly shaping decisions far from their Tuscan home. Even in their decline, the Medici left lasting imprints. By the 18th century, when the last Medici Grand Duke died without an heir, the family's direct line ended, yet their cultural and political achievements remained. The art collections they had nurtured became the foundation of museums, most famously the Uffizi Gallery. Their libraries preserved texts that fueled centuries of scholarship, and their city, Florence, remained adorned with palaces, chapels, and public spaces bearing their mark. One might think of their story not as a fading of power, but as a transformation, shifting from direct control to a legacy woven into the daily life of generations who followed. The Medici demonstrate how power can be built not only with swords or crowns but with subtler tools: credit, patronage, and vision. They remind us that history is shaped as much by those who finance ideas as by those who wage wars. To study them is to glimpse how wealth can ripple outward into art, politics, and thought, leaving traces that endure long after the family itself has vanished. If you let your attention settle on the long sweep of Central Europe, you might imagine valleys shaped by the Danube, alpine passes where the air thins and cools, and market towns that grew like knots along river bends. In that landscape, the Habsburgs formed themselves slowly, first as lords of a castle on a Hawk's Hill in what is now northern Switzerland, and then as patient gatherers of lands, titles, and loyalties. Their earliest strength was not a glittering army, but a capacity for endurance, a willingness to wait as borders shifted and dynasties faltered. When Rudolf of Habsburg was elected King of the Romans in 1273, it did not crown a sudden rise, it confirmed a method, steady and deliberate, that preferred continuity to risk. You might think of them less as conquerors and more as caretakers who learned to fold diverse provinces into a single layered fabric. With each generation, the fabric thickened until it could be called an empire. From the beginning, geography shaped their choices as surely as genealogy did. The Alpine ridges offered natural fortresses, but also obstacles that turned travel into careful planning and supply into a seasonal rhythm. To the east, the plains opened toward Hungary, and the frontier with the Ottoman world, where summer campaigns depended on roads hard enough for wagons and rivers low enough to ford. The Danube served as a quiet companion, carrying barges of grain, lumber, and salt, and drawing towns into cooperation because the river did not recognize princely borders. In winter, court moved by sleigh and sled, and letters took longer to arrive, sharpening the Habsburg preference for delegated authority and written routine. In their provinces, local diets reflected climate: rye bread and cabbage in upland villages, fish and wine along milder riverbanks, and paprika-scented stews further east. Power grew, not just from capitals, but from understanding these patterns of weather, harvest, and road. By the late Middle Ages, the Habsburgs had learned their most durable lesson, that a marriage could redraw maps more gently than a campaign could. The old saying, often rendered as "let others wage war, you fortunate Austria marry," captures a policy that turned brides and grooms into diplomatic bridges. When Maximilian I married Mary of Burgundy in 1477, he gained not only new lands but new obligations, learning to speak the language of Flemish guilds and to court the loyalty of merchants in Antwerp and Ghent. Their son Philip married Joanna of Castile, and in that union lay the future of Spanish crowns, American silver, and Mediterranean fleets. The Habsburg method was not merely to acquire but to absorb, to fold new territories into a legal and ceremonial order that felt consistent even when the languages, costumes, and calendars differed. You might picture wedding processions as slow-moving caravans of trunks and tapestries, carrying with them the agreements that would outlast the music. When Charles V inherited this interlaced fortune in the 16th century, he found himself at the center of a world that stretched from Bohemian forests to Andean mines. He did not so much rule a single state as balance a constellation of obligations: the Holy Roman Empire with its electors and diets, Spain with its councils and colonies, and Italy with its interwoven duchies and bishoprics. His court moved often, because the empire had no fixed capital, and with each move came petitions about coinage, salt rights, and the safe conduct of scholars. The Reformation added another layer of complexity, as pastors and princes argued not only about theology, but about the jurisdictions of marriage courts and poor relief. In such a web, the Habsburg talent for paperwork became a quietly decisive strength. Clerks produced files with ribbons and wax seals, and decisions could be traced through a chain of careful hands. Where others saw chaos, the Habsburgs tended to see procedures that required patience. The dynastic split that followed, Spanish Habsburgs on one branch, Austrian on the other, did not end a shared temperament. In Spain, the line would be known for stiff etiquette and portraits that captured unblinking faces under heavy black cloth. In the Austrian land, a different courtly rhythm persisted, more open to Italian architects and German jurists, and to the practicalities of managing estates dotted with market towns. Daily life in Vienna acquired rituals that visitors noticed: the early mass in the chapel, the set times for the audience, and a midday meal that combined simplicity with formality. Musicians rehearsed inside chambers, and riding masters trained the Lipizzaner stallions, whose calm precision seemed a metaphor for imperial discipline. Meanwhile, in countryside manors, stewards calculated rents in chalk on slate, and peasants brought chickens and wool as part of their obligations. The empire had an aroma: beeswax polish in palaces, smoke from hearths, and the denser smell of tanneries along the river. Religion lay close to the dynasty's heart, not only as conviction, but as a framework for order. The 30 Years' War taught hard lessons about the limits of confessional policy and the weariness of prolonged conflict. Habsburg leaders learned to alternate firmness with accommodation, extending charters here, standardizing parish life there, and appointing bishops who could speak the dialect of their flocks. Jesuit colleges multiplied, offering instruction in rhetoric and mathematics as much as in doctrine, producing clerks who could calculate interest and mediate village disputes. The cathedral calendar, with its sequence of fasts and feasts, gave the empire a steady drumbeat, so that even in remote towns people felt aligned with a larger rhythm. Faith for the Habsburgs was less a trumpet than a bell, calling people to recognizable routines. The 18th century brought a figure who embodied steady reform in a maternal tone: Maria Theresa. She inherited not just crowns but the anxieties of neighboring powers who doubted a woman's right to rule. Her response was not theatrical, it was administrative. She reorganized taxation to be more regular, and created schools where children learned to read the paperwork that would later define their obligations. She standardized army uniforms and ration schedules, not as symbols but as tools to reduce waste. For village families, her policies slowly reshaped days. More visits from officials with notebooks, more predictable weights and measures in the market, and new expectations that midwives register births. In her reign, the empire felt less like a patchwork and more like a quilt, stitched with straighter seams. Joseph II, her son, added an impatient brightness, like a candle held closer to the page. He issued edicts that sought to simplify and secularize, suppressing idle monasteries while protecting useful ones that ran schools and hospitals. He promoted the rights of non-Catholic subjects and loosened the bonds of serfdom, hoping that freer farmers would mean fuller granaries and steadier tax receipts. Not all reforms settled comfortably. Some met the stubbornness of custom and the limits of infrastructure. Yet even the edicts that were softened or reversed left traces in the way local courts handled inheritance and the way guilds trained apprentices. You might imagine a clerk adjusting to a new form, scratching out an old heading and writing a fresh one above it, the ink drying as slowly as tradition yielded. The empire's most distinctive quality may have been its multilingual hush. In a single day at the Hofburg, you could hear Italian in a corridor where architects discussed a facade, Sloven in the servants' quarters, German at the chancery tables, and Czech among tradesmen unloading barrels in the courtyard. This polyphony encouraged a certain patience. Orders had to be repeated, and often translated, and humour took the form of gentle misunderstandings rather than sharp wit. In provincial diets, Bohemia, Galicia, the Tyrol, delegates arrived in coats that reflected local tailoring, their minutes carefully recorded by scribes who knew when to pause for interpretation. The result was not a single identity, but a habit of coexistence, reinforced by the simple needs of trade and harvest. The Habsburgs presided less over a chorus of one voice than over a choir that had learned, over time, to blend. Music gave that habit of blending a public face. In 18th century Vienna, the court supported orchestras and chapels, where new compositions were tried quietly before they found wider homes. Composers moved through a world of patronage that rewarded reliability alongside invention, writing masses for feast days and symphonies for suburban palaces. The waltz arrived later, bringing a gentle spin to middle-class evenings and city gardens, where lanterns swung and couples traced circles on wooden floors. Coffeehouses, meanwhile, became living rooms for public life, places where editors read proofs, students debated, and retired officers considered the shape of the empire on a map. If you listen in imagination, you can hear spoons tapping porcelain and the soft thud of newspapers folded just so, a domestic murmur that underpinned the grand titles. Beyond the city, estates anchored the empire's economy. In Moravia and Lower Austria, fields of rye and barley undulated under breezes that smelled faintly of hay and clay. In Bohemia, ponds were engineered to raise carp for Lenten tables, a practice that turned landscape into a system of quiet reservoirs and sluices. In Hungary's plains, horse herds moved like shaded waves, and markets filled with paprika and wine. Estate managers kept ledgers that recorded not only yields but weather, noting late frosts and dry summers because the state's needs were inseparable from the sky's moods. Grain moved along the Danube toward Vienna, and timber floated down from mountain forests, tying regions into circuits that made taxes possible and soldiers fed. It was an empire of barns as much as of palaces. The 19th century offered both confidence and tremor. Revolutions elsewhere sent ripples that reached the Danube's banks, and students in Vienna learned to speak the language of constitutions, as well as the dialects of their home valleys. The court answered with a blend of concession and continuity. New councils formed, censorship waxed and waned, and railways were laid like threads binding provinces more tightly to the capital. Train stations brought timetables into daily life, so that even villages began to measure hours by departures rather than by bells alone. A soldier could leave Galicia at dawn and find himself in Bohemia by nightfall, and with him travelled newspapers, seed catalogues, and habits of punctuality that ironed small irregularities in the old rhythms. Bureaucracy adapted, issuing tickets, passports, and instruction sheets that taught even hesitant readers how to navigate a modern state. In this era, Franz Joseph's long tenure provided a kind of metronome. His day began early and proceeded with a precision that courtiers learned to mirror. Audiences at set hours, margins for signatures, and a measured pace that made change feel less like a break and more like an amendment. The empire, too, preferred amendments to rupture, new compromises with Hungary, new arrangements with provincial diets, and new uniforms that tried to honor regimental pride while standardizing supply. City life thickened. Ring roads replaced walls, and apartment houses rose with balconies, where geraniums added points of color to orderly facades. Tailors learned to cut for clerks who sat at desks rather than for soldiers who rode, and shopkeepers sold umbrellas and ledgers alongside boots and salt. The monarchy became, in mood, a custodian of everyday regularities. Even as strains grew, national movements, fiscal demands, and the hard arithmetic of keeping many peoples content, the Habsburg habit of moderation persisted. It showed in how officials handled petitions from village councils, in how judges considered language rights in schools, and in how postmasters kept routes open even when budgets thinned. The empire's decline, when it came, followed the logic of exhaustion rather than spectacle. War forced schedules into chaos, requisitions into barns, and absences into family tables. Yet the legacy that remained after the crowns were packed away was not only a memory of borders but of institutions that had taught millions to live together with paperwork, shared markets, and the comfort of predictable hours. In that sense, the dynasty's most lasting power was the ability to make very different lives feel legible to one another. The Habsburgs shaped history by insisting that variety could be administered rather than erased. They preferred arrangement to conquest, procedures to proclamations, and courtyards where people waited their turn to corridors where they shouted. Their empire was not a single story, but a library of local chronicles, bound under one set of arms and maintained by clerks who respected indexes. You might imagine an archivist in a cool room, stacking files labeled in different hands, German, Italian, Czech, Hungarian, and tying them with soft cotton tape. The bundle is not elegant, but it holds. To study the Habsburgs is to watch how that bundle was made, tightened, and finally set on a shelf where later states would come to consult it. And in that quiet endurance, their influence lingers like the scent of paper and sealing wax, long after the room has emptied. Maximilian, remembered as the Last Knight, embodied the transition between medieval chivalry and the emerging modern state. Born in 1459, he grew up amidst jousts, hunts, and the feudal rhythms of his ancestors, yet he also recognized that Europe was shifting toward gunpowder, printing presses, and standing armies. He relished tournaments, appearing in shining armor, but he also issued reforms that standardized coinage and encouraged trade. His marriage to Mary of Burgundy brought him vast territories in the Low Countries, and with them a taste for cities where merchants held as much influence as knights. You might picture him riding into Brussels, greeted not by feudal vassals but by guild leaders holding banners, each representing their trade. Maximilian's reign stitched together old and new worlds, and the thread he used most often was marriage, that patient tool of expansion. His grandson Charles V inherited not just lands but an almost overwhelming responsibility. Born in Ghent in 1500, Charles grew up speaking several languages but never feeling entirely at home in any of them. When he became ruler, he held Spain with its American colonies, the Netherlands, Austria, parts of Italy, and the sprawling Holy Roman Empire. His motto could have been, "The empire on which the sun never sets," though the phrase was not yet coined. Daily life for Charles was marked by movement. His court was peripatetic, moving across Europe as he tried to balance obligations. His schedule was filled with petitions, diets, and councils, yet he also carried a private burden, the endless paperwork of empire. Letters arrived daily from Seville, reporting on silver fleets, from Vienna on the threat of Ottoman campaigns, from German princes on religious disputes. You might imagine his desk covered with folded papers sealed in red wax, the air heavy with the smell of ink. It was a life not of peace, but of balancing, holding together regions that might otherwise drift apart. The Reformation cast its long shadow over Charles's reign. Martin Luther's challenge to the Catholic Church was more than a theological quarrel. It reshaped politics, economics, and identity. For the Habsburgs, defenders of the faith, it meant decades of negotiation and conflict. The Diet of Worms in 1521, where Luther refused to recant, became a moment when Charles stood as the figure of imperial orthodoxy. Yet he could not silence the tide of reform. Instead, he found himself fighting wars that drained treasuries and weakened unity. Still, the empire endured, a testament to how the Habsburgs could bend without breaking. The very survival of their dynasty through the Reformation demonstrates their preference for patience and adaptation over rashness. Life under Habsburg rule varied widely across their territories. In Austrian villages, Peasants tilled narrow strips of land, sowing rye and barley. In Hungarian plains, horsemen herded livestock across wide horizons, their songs carrying across the steppe. In Bohemian towns, beer brewing was a respected craft, and guilds carefully guarded their privileges. In the Low Countries, merchants calculated profits from Atlantic trade, their counting houses buzzing with figures that connected Antwerp to Lisbon and beyond. For ordinary people, empire was felt in taxes collected, soldiers billeted, and judges enforcing imperial law. It was also visible in symbols, the double-headed eagle, spreading its wings on coins, banners, and city gates, reminding citizens that their lives were part of a larger layered whole. Maria Theresa, centuries later, exemplified how the dynasty could adapt once more. Born in 1717, she was never expected to inherit, yet when her father Charles VI died, she became ruler of the Habsburg lands. Neighbours doubted her strength, but she proved steady and practical. She reorganized taxation, standardized schools, and demanded efficiency from her officials. She was also a devoted mother, raising 16 children, many of whom were married into other royal houses. Her daughter Marie Antoinette would become Queen of France. Her son Joseph II would inherit her reforms and expand them. Under Maria Theresa, daily life for subjects began to feel the presence of the state more directly. School inspectors visited villages, soldiers were registered more carefully, and markets grew more regulated. You might picture a farmer weighing his produce at a market stall, confident that the new standardized weights meant fairer trade. Joseph II, her son, approached reform with restless energy. He slept little, toured provinces relentlessly, and wrote edicts that poured from his desk in stacks. He reduced the power of monasteries that did not serve practical functions, expanded religious toleration, and loosened restrictions on serfs. He was impatient, perhaps too much so, for many of his changes met resistance from people who preferred the familiar to the efficient. Yet his reforms left traces. Farmers gained more autonomy, religious minorities found more space, and the machinery of the state grew more rational. His reign reveals the Habsburg paradox: rulers who wanted to modernize while preserving tradition, reformers who were also guardians of continuity. Court life in Vienna reflected this balance of tradition and adaptation. The Hofburg Palace was not a single building, but a sprawling complex of wings, courtyards, and halls. Developed over centuries, its rooms echoed with ceremony, audiences, balls, and council meetings. Protocol was strict. Courtiers had to follow elaborate rules of dress, bowing at precise angles, speaking at prescribed moments. Meals were carefully ordered, with courses reflecting both Austrian staples and foreign delicacies. A visitor might taste venison with dumplings, followed by sugared pastries brought from Bohemian kitchens. Music filled the palace. Composers like Haydn and Mozart worked under Habsburg patronage, their compositions echoing through gilded halls. Evenings were not simply entertainment, but part of the ritual of rule, reinforcing the dynasty's image as both cultured and authoritative. In the countryside, festivals offered a gentler glimpse of Habsburg influence. Villages celebrated harvest with fairs that blended local tradition with imperial symbolism. Fiddlers played, dancers moved in circles, and banners displayed imperial arms beside village emblems. Taxes were collected alongside festivities, a reminder that joy and obligation coexisted. Priests blessed crops under imperial patronage, linking faith with loyalty. For many peasants, the empire was not an abstract idea, but the rhythm of seasons marked by both toil and ceremony. The Habsburg jaw, a distinctive feature caused by generations of intermarriage, became a symbol of both their continuity and their limitation. Portraits of rulers like Charles II of Spain display the protruding chin and heavy lower lip that later generations would call unmistakably Habsburg. While the physical feature sometimes carried health complications, it also became a curious emblem of dynastic persistence. Even today, it stands as a reminder of how the family's reliance on marriage to consolidate power had unintended consequences, visible in the very faces of their rulers. The long reign of Franz Joseph in the 19th century brought the Habsburg story into modern times. He ascended to the throne in 1848, a year of revolutions, and remained until 1916, spanning an era of industrialization, nationalism, and shifting loyalties. His daily routine was famously rigid, rising early, reading reports, signing documents, receiving officials. He valued punctuality and discipline, qualities reflected in the bureaucracy that sustained his rule. The empire under him was vast and diverse, with railways, factories and schools weaving together peoples who spoke dozens of languages. Yet the strains of nationalism grew stronger, and Franz Joseph's calm routine became in many ways the empire's anchor against fragmentation. You might picture him at his desk in the Hofburg, pen in hand, his lined face reflecting both the weight of tradition and the persistence of duty. The collapse of the Habsburg Empire after the First World War did not erase its influence. Successor states inherited its bureaucratic habits, its railways, its schools, and its laws. In some ways, the empire continues in quieter forms, in the shared architecture of Central Europe, in the coffee houses of Vienna, in the legal codes that shaped civil life. The Habsburgs remind us that power can be as much about persistence as brilliance, about continuity as conquest. Their empire was not built in a single sweep, but in layers, patiently added, like rings of growth in an ancient tree. In the early 17th century, Russia was a land unsettled. The time of troubles had left it weakened. With rival claimants to the throne, foreign armies intruding across borders, and famine gnawing at villages, out of this turmoil emerged a new family, whose name would come to dominate Russia for more than 3 centuries, the Romanovs. Their ascent began not with grand conquest but with a compromise, a gathering of nobles who sought stability after years of uncertainty. In 1613, a young boy of 16, Mikhail Romanov, was chosen as Tsar. He was hesitant, even reluctant, but his election marked the start of a dynasty that would carry Russia from medieval roots into the complexities of modern Europe. You might imagine him, still a teenager, hearing the weight of bells toll across Moscow, announcing to a weary people that a new Tsar had been found. The Romanovs inherited a Russia, vast but fragile. The geography itself was both a gift and a challenge. Endless forests stretched in all directions, pierced by rivers that froze in winter and swelled in spring. Winters were long and harsh, shaping habits of endurance and caution. Villages clustered around wooden churches, their onion domes rising like painted flames above snowdrifts. Life for peasants was marked by subsistence farming, dependence on the rhythms of season, and the obligations of serfdom, which bound them to estates. To govern such a land required more than decrees. It demanded rituals and symbols that bound distant provinces to the throne in Moscow. For the early Romanovs, survival meant careful balance, reassuring the boyars, the noble families, while slowly strengthening the Tsar's hand. By the late 17th century, Peter I, later called Peter the Great, would change the dynasty's trajectory. Tall, energetic, and restless, Peter looked outward in a way few Russian rulers had before him. He travelled to Western Europe in disguise, learning shipbuilding in Dutch yards and studying military techniques in Prussian camps. When he returned, he began to reshape Russia with relentless determination. He ordered the building of a navy, reorganized the army, and founded a new capital, St. Petersburg on marshland at the edge of the Baltic. The city rose with straight avenues, canals, and palaces, modelled after European designs but bearing Russian resilience. You might picture the sound of hammers on frozen timbers, labourers driving piles into waterlogged soil, and Peter himself walking among them, urging speed despite the cold. St. Petersburg was not only a city but a statement that Russia, under the Romanovs, would no longer stand apart from Europe but join its concert of powers. Daily life under Peter was unsettled by reform. He ordered nobles to shave their traditional beards, introducing a tax for those who refused. He reorganized clothing, demanding Western styles at court. He revised calendars and introduced secular schools. For many, these changes were bewildering, even unwelcome. A boy of Prussia had long worn fur robes and kept ancient rituals, now found himself in tailored coats, navigating new etiquette at court. Yet beneath the discomfort lay a larger transformation. Russia was being pushed toward a new identity, one that combined its old Orthodox traditions with the efficiencies and styles of the West. In taverns and markets, peasants continued their old songs, but in palaces, the rhythm of minuets and European court dances began to take hold. Catherine II, remembered as Catherine the Great, carried forward and refined this vision, a German princess by birth. She came to the throne in 1762 and ruled for more than 3 decades. Under her, Russia expanded its territory southward into the Black Sea region and westward into Poland. She corresponded with Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire and Diderot, while also reinforcing the authority of the autocracy at home. Her court glittered with French language and manners, even as serfs remained bound to the land. The contrast between gilded halls in St. Petersburg and wooden huts in distant villages was stark, yet it defined the Romanov Empire: grandeur at the top, endurance at the bottom. You might picture candlelit salons where aristocrats debated philosophy, while hundreds of miles away peasants huddled around hearths against the Russian winter, their lives untouched by such ideas. The Romanov dynasty also nurtured culture that blended European influence with Russian depth. Churches continued to rise with onion domes painted in bright blues and golds, their interiors glowing with icons. Music developed under court patronage, blending folk melodies with European composition. By the 19th century, Russian literature flourished. Pushkin, Gogol, and later Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, writers whose works reflected the vastness of the empire and the struggles of its people. Though not all were directly patronized by the Tsars, the atmosphere of Imperial Russia, with its contrasts of splendor and suffering, gave their words resonance. The Romanovs, by ruling such a diverse and contradictory empire, created the soil from which these cultural achievements grew. Nicholas I, ruling from 1825 to 1855, embodied autocracy in its most rigid form. He insisted on strict discipline, both in the army and in society. His motto of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality framed his vision of the state. Life under Nicholas was orderly but heavy with censorship. Universities were watched, books banned, and secret police monitored dissent. Yet, the railways he encouraged slowly began to shrink Russia's distances, bringing provincial towns closer to the capitals. Soldiers marched across endless steppes in precise lines, and engineers laid tracks that would one day stretch across Siberia. Nicholas's reign was like a fortress, protective, rigid, but ultimately brittle, for it left little space for adaptation. His grandson Alexander II recognized this brittleness and sought reform. In 1861, he emancipated the serfs, freeing millions from legal bondage to estates. It was a monumental act, though imperfect, for peasants often received small plots of land and remained burdened by debt. Still, the change reshaped village life, giving families more autonomy and a sense of dignity. Schools expanded, military service was reorganized, and courts were modernized. In the cities, a new middle class slowly began to grow, their shops and workshops hinting at a different Russia. Yet Alexander II's reforms also stirred discontent, for some demanded more, while others feared the erosion of tradition. In 1881, he was assassinated by revolutionaries, a reminder that even well-meaning change could spark turbulence. By the turn of the 20th century, Nicholas II faced an empire under strain. Industrialization brought crowded cities, with workers demanding better conditions. National movements stirred in Poland, Finland, and the Caucasus. War with Japan in 1904 to 1905 ended in humiliation, shaking confidence in the dynasty. The revolution of 1905 forced Nicholas to grant a parliament, the Duma, though he restricted its power. Life for ordinary Russians remained difficult. Peasants still toiled in fields, soldiers drilled in harsh conditions, and workers endured long hours in factories. Yet alongside hardship there was also vibrancy. Music, theatre, and literature flourished, capturing both the grandeur and the anxiety of a society on the edge of change. The First World War brought these tensions to breaking point. Russia's armies suffered immense losses, supply lines faltered, and cities faced shortages. Nicholas II, taking personal command of the army, left the capital in the hands of his wife Alexandra, whose reliance on the mystic Rasputin further eroded confidence in the throne. The war strain was too much for the dynasty to bear. In 1917, Nicholas abdicated, ending more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule. Later that year, amid revolution and civil war, he and his family were executed. The dynasty that had risen in compromise and endured through adaptation ended in tragedy. Their palaces left as silent witnesses. And yet the Romanovs' legacy lingers. The architecture of St. Petersburg, the literature born under their rule, the reforms and rituals that shaped Russian society, all continue to echo. To think of them is to see both splendor and shadow, gilded palaces and frozen villages, reform and repression. The Romanovs demonstrate how dynasties can shape not only politics but culture, leaving behind a legacy that is both beautiful and burdened. To understand the Romanovs fully, it is helpful to step into the texture of Russian daily life during their centuries of rule. For peasants, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population, existence was shaped by the rhythm of the seasons and the obligations of serfdom. Wooden houses with steep roofs stood in clusters, smoke curling from chimneys even in deep winter. Inside, a central stove warmed the room, served as a bed for children, and provided the heat for bread and porridge. Clothing was simple: linen shirts, wool coats, and boots of bast or leather, depending on wealth. Life was communal, families worked fields together, and the village assembly, the mirror, often decided how land was divided among households. Under Romanov rule, peasants were bound by law to their estates until the emancipation of 1861, meaning their daily toil sustained the grandeur of palaces hundreds of miles away. Religion was the thread that bound this life. The Russian Orthodox Church, with its processions, icons, and chanting, shaped not only belief but time itself. Feasts and fasts filled the calendar, giving structure to years that otherwise might blend into the monotony of labor. Easter, with its midnight liturgy and the sharing of painted eggs, brought moments of joy after long winters. Icons, often painted in glowing gold and deep colors, stood in the corner of peasant homes, watched over meals, prayers, and disputes. Under the Romanovs, orthodoxy was promoted as the empire's spiritual anchor, a marker of identity distinct from Catholic or Protestant Europe. In grand cathedrals of Moscow and St. Petersburg, the same liturgies were sung as in small wooden churches on the steppe, reminding subjects that they belong to a single spiritual realm, no matter how vast their distances. At the top of society, court life under the Romanovs glittered with ceremony. St. Petersburg, the city Peter the Great founded on the Baltic, became the showcase of imperial power. Palaces such as the Winter Palace and Catherine Palace shimmered with gold leaf, mirrored halls, and vast ballrooms. Balls were not merely entertainment, they were instruments of politics, where alliances were signalled through who danced with whom, and etiquette reinforced hierarchy. Ladies of the court wore gowns of silken velvet, adorned with jewels that reflected candlelight. Men wore uniforms glittering with medals and epaulets. Foreign visitors often marvelled at the sheer scale of these events, though some noted the contrast between the magnificence inside and the icy streets outside, where beggars and soldiers mingled. You might imagine chandeliers swaying gently with music, while beyond palace gates, sleighs moved through snow-covered squares under starlight. The Romanovs' fascination with Western Europe produced curious blends of culture. Peter's reforms brought European clothing, dances, and administrative models, yet Russian traditions remained strong. A noble might attend a French play in St. Petersburg one evening, then travel to a country estate where meals followed old Slavic customs of pickled vegetables, black bread, and kvass. Language itself carried the tension. French was often spoken at court, while Russian remained the tongue of the army and the village. This divide reflected not only taste but identity, as nobles debated whether Russia's future lay in imitation of the West or in preservation of its own path. The Romanovs presided over this tension, sometimes leaning one way, sometimes the other, but always aware that their empire's uniqueness lay in being both European and distinct from Europe. One of the dynasty's recurring challenges was its vastness. The empire stretched across forests, steppe, mountains, and tundra, encompassing dozens of ethnic groups: Poles, Finns, Tatars, Armenians, Georgians, and more. Each brought languages, costumes, and customs into the empire. Administration often relied on tolerance tempered by control, allowing local traditions but demanding loyalty to the Tsar. In Kazan, mosques stood alongside Orthodox churches. In the Caucasus, Armenian monasteries continued their rituals. In Siberia, indigenous peoples paid tribute in furs. The Romanovs managed this diversity less through assimilation than through hierarchy, making the Tsar a distant but unifying figure. You might picture an imperial edict read aloud in a marketplace by a clerk who translated it into local speech, reminding villagers that however far from Moscow or St. Petersburg, they were still subjects of the Romanovs. Legends and myths also surrounded the family. Some viewed the Tsar as a little father, a paternal figure who cared for his people, even if distant. Folklore sometimes painted the monarch as semi-sacred, chosen by God. This image endured even when reality was harsher, for peasants could blame cruel landlords or corrupt officials, while still imagining the Tsar as benevolent. Later, the Romanovs became the subject of darker myths, especially after their fall. Rumors that one of Nicholas II's daughters, Anastasia, had survived the execution of the family persisted for decades. capturing imaginations in novels and films. These myths reveal how deeply the dynasty had entered the Russian consciousness, not merely as rulers but as symbols woven into stories of hope and loss. The contrast between grandeur and hardship reached striking form in the 19th century. St. Petersburg's avenues, with their neoclassical facades and gaslit streets, presented Russia as a European capital. Yet only a few miles away, workers crowded into wooden barracks, their lives marked by poverty and illness. The Romanovs relied on both worlds, the prestige of the capital to impress foreign envoys, and the labor of peasants and workers to sustain their armies and palaces. This duality gave Russian literature its depth. Writers such as Dostoevsky captured the desperation of poverty alongside the opulence of drawing rooms, while Tolstoy explored the tensions of nobility, trying to live moral lives amid luxury. These works endure partly because they reflect the contradictions of Romanov Russia itself. Comparisons to other dynasties highlight the Romanovs' uniqueness. The Habsburgs built their empire on compromise and administration. The Medici wielded patronage and finance. The Romanovs relied on autocracy, reinforced by ritual. Unlike the English monarchy, which negotiated with Parliament, the Romanovs resisted sharing power, clinging to the ideal of the Tsar as sole ruler. This gave them stability for centuries, but left them vulnerable when modernization demanded flexibility. Their longevity testifies to the strength of symbols and rituals, but their collapse shows the risks of resisting adaptation too long. In their story, one sees how dynasties can endure until they no longer can. As the 19th century drew to a close, Russia's industrialization created both promise and peril. Factories sprouted in Moscow and St. Petersburg, where workers endured long hours in poor conditions. Railways extended deep into Siberia, symbolized by the Trans-Siberian Railway, which linked European Russia to the Pacific. These developments shrank distances and connected regions, but they also spread discontent, as workers and peasants became more aware of inequalities. The Romanovs sponsored projects of grandeur, palaces, monuments, and military parades, yet beneath the surface, unrest simmered. Their empire was like a frozen river in spring, solid on top, but with currents moving powerfully beneath. The end of the dynasty in 1917 carries a quiet inevitability in hindsight, though at the time it was chaotic and uncertain. Nicholas II, personally devout and family-oriented, struggled to meet the demands of modern rule. His reliance on Alexandra and her trust in Rasputin eroded confidence at court. The First World War exposed the empire's weaknesses: poor supply, strained industry, and mounting casualties. When revolution came, it was less a sudden storm than the breaking of ice under too much weight. The execution of the family in 1918 was brutal, but it symbolized the end of an era. Russia would no longer be ruled by dynasties, but by ideologies. Still, the memory of the Romanovs remained, preserved in photographs of children playing in palace gardens, in portraits of emperors in gold braid, and in the architecture of cities that still bear their stamp. Their legacy is not easy to define. They left behind grandeur in architecture, literature, and art, but also memories of oppression and missed opportunities for reform. They shaped Russia's identity as a vast, autocratic, and spiritual empire, while also sowing the seeds of revolution through their rigidity. To reflect on the Romanovs is to sense both splendor and melancholy, a dynasty that illuminated Russia while also casting long shadows. Their presence still lingers in Orthodox prayers for the martyred Tsar, in the glittering domes of St. Petersburg, and in the imaginations of those who see them as symbols of a lost world. At the dawn of the 14th century, on the rugged frontiers of Anatolia, a small principality began to take form under the leadership of Osman I, a Turkish chieftain, whose name would later lend itself to an empire. The world he inherited was fragmented. The once mighty Seljuk Sultanate of Rum had declined, Byzantine strongholds lingered in the west, and Mongol influences stretched faintly across the east. In this shifting landscape, Osman and his followers carved out a space defined not only by military skill, but by flexibility. They blended traditions from Turkic steppe warriors, Islamic governance, and Byzantine administration. Over the centuries, this blend would evolve into the Ottoman Empire, a state that endured for more than 600 years, spanning Europe, Asia, and Africa. Life in early Ottoman villages reflected the frontier character of the state. Farmers cultivated wheat and barley, while herders drove flocks across hillsides. Wooden mosques stood at the heart of communities, their minarets modest but steady markers of faith. Markets brought together Turks, Greeks, Armenians, and others, exchanging textiles, spices, and livestock. Warfare was frequent, but so too was negotiation. Alliances were made through marriage, tribute, or conversion. The Ottomans did not rise as conquerors alone, but as absorbers, drawing strength from those they incorporated. You might picture a village square where Arabic prayers mingled with Greek speech, and where soldiers preparing for campaign paused to share bread with merchants arranging their goods. By the mid-15th century, the Ottomans had transformed into a formidable power, and their greatest symbol of ascent came in 1453 with the conquest of Constantinople. Sultan Mehmed II, known as the Conqueror, led his forces against the ancient Byzantine capital. Cannons roared against walls that had stood for 1,000 years, and after weeks of siege, the city fell. With its capture, the Ottomans gained not only a strategic capital, but a profound sense of legitimacy. The Hagia Sophia, the vast Byzantine church, was converted into a mosque, its domes echoing with new prayers. Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, became the beating heart of an empire that bridged continents. You might imagine the city's skyline after the conquest, its ancient walls now flying Ottoman banners, and its domes and minarets glistening in the light of both sunrise and history. The empire's system of governance reflected its diversity. The Sultan was the supreme authority, yet administration relied on a hierarchy of viziers, judges, and provincial governors. The devshirme system, through which Christian boys were taken from their families, converted to Islam, and trained for service, created a class of loyal administrators and soldiers. Many of these became janissaries, the elite infantry corps famed for their discipline. The janissaries lived in barracks, trained with muskets, and marched in formation, representing a new kind of military strength. For centuries they formed the backbone of Ottoman expansion, yet their presence also shaped daily life in the capital, as their music, uniforms, and rituals became part of Istanbul's rhythm. At the same time, the Ottomans developed a culture of remarkable tolerance compared to many contemporaries. Non-Muslims, Christians and Jews, were organized into millets, self-governing communities allowed to practice their faith and administer their own affairs, provided they paid taxes and remained loyal. This system allowed the empire to manage vast diversity without demanding uniformity. In a single Ottoman city, you might hear church bells ringing near the call to prayer, and see Jewish merchants negotiating in the same markets as Muslim artisans. The empire's strength lay in this coexistence, a recognition that harmony could be maintained through autonomy. The reign of Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century marked the zenith of Ottoman power. Under his rule, the empire stretched from Hungary in the west to Mesopotamia in the east, from North Africa to the Arabian Peninsula. Suleiman was not only a conqueror, but a legislator, known as the lawgiver, for his codification of legal systems. His court in Istanbul shone with art, poetry, and architecture. The architect Sinan, serving as chief builder, created mosques whose domes seemed to float on air, such as the Suleymaniye Mosque, which still dominates the city's skyline. You might imagine its courtyard filled with worshippers, the scent of incense mingling with the cool stone, while outside, the city bustled with traders from across the known world. Ottoman daily life varied greatly across regions. In Istanbul, grand bazaars offered textiles from Persia, spices from India, and silks from China. Coffeehouses emerged as centers of conversation, where men gathered to sip strong coffee, smoke pipes, and listen to storytellers. In provincial towns, markets were humbler, but the rhythms were similar: commerce, faith, and community weaving together. Rural peasants tilled fields, their lives marked by the harvest and by obligations to landlords or state officials. In desert regions, nomads moved with their flocks, their tents forming temporary villages. The empire encompassed so many landscapes that its unity was less about uniform customs and more about shared allegiance to the Sultan. The harem, often misunderstood in Western imagination, was another central institution of the dynasty. Far from being a place of idle luxury, it was a political sphere where marriages and alliances were crafted. Women of the harem, particularly the Valid Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, wielded significant influence in court politics. During the period known as the Sultanate of Women, figures like Kursum Sultan guided policies, arranged marriages, and even acted as regents. This aspect of the empire reminds us that power within dynasties was not always confined to thrones and battlefields, but often flowed through private spaces, negotiations, and maternal authority. As centuries passed, the empire's fortunes shifted. The Janissaries, once disciplined, grew powerful and resistant to reform. European rivals advanced in technology, trade, and naval power, slowly outpacing the Ottomans. Yet even in periods of decline, the empire retained resilience. The 17th and 18th centuries saw both setbacks and revivals. As sultans alternated between campaigns and reforms, daily life continued, coffeehouses thrived, and bazaars remained lively. For ordinary subjects, decline was not always visible. Taxes were collected, markets opened, and prayers continued in mosques as they always had. By the 19th century, pressures from both within and without demanded change. Reformers introduced the Tanzimat, a series of modernizing edicts that sought to reorganize the army, standardize law, and create more equality among subjects. Railways were built, telegraphs installed, and schools expanded. In Istanbul, horse-drawn trams clattered along new avenues, while in rural Anatolia, villages changed little, still bound to seasons and soil. The contrast between tradition and modernity became sharper, yet the Ottomans continued to balance both, just as they always had, absorbing, adapting, and enduring. The twilight of the dynasty came in the early 20th century, with wars that chipped away at territory and the strain of the First World War proving too great. In 1922, the Sultanate was abolished, and the last Ottoman ruler, Mehmed VI, left Istanbul aboard a British ship. Yet the imprint of the dynasty remains. Istanbul's skyline still gleams with their mosques. Turkish cuisine carries their legacy of diverse influences, and the traditions of law and tolerance they developed echo in many parts of the modern Middle East and Balkans. The Ottomans shaped history not only through conquest but through their ability to govern difference, to hold together peoples and lands with a patience that outlasted many rivals. Ottoman strength lay not only in their armies or palaces, but in the daily lives of their people, spread across 3 continents. In Anatolian villages, peasants rose at dawn, their day marked by the call to prayer and the tasks of tending fields of wheat, vines, and olives. Women managed households, spinning wool, baking bread in clay ovens, and drawing water from communal wells. Children herded goats along dusty paths or carried baskets to market. Fridays brought special prayers at the mosque, while feast days gathered communities and shared meals, often with rice pilafs, lamb stews, and sweet pastries like baklava. The empire was vast, but the rhythm of ordinary life was shared in its essentials: faith, family, and the turning of seasons. In Istanbul, life had a different texture. The Grand Bazaar, established in the 15th century and expanded over centuries, became a world unto itself. Vaulted halls sheltered thousands of shops where merchants sold carpets from Persia, ceramics from Iznik, silks from Bursa, and spices from India. The air carried the mingled scents of leather, coffee, and incense. Bargaining was an art, and relationships between buyers and sellers often lasted generations. Coffee houses, meanwhile, provided gathering places where men discussed politics, listened to storytellers, and played backgammon. These establishments were sometimes viewed with suspicion by the authorities, for they encouraged debate and satire, yet they thrived nonetheless. To walk through Istanbul was to feel the empire in miniature, its diversity compressed into a single bustling cityscape. The ceremony reinforced the grandeur of the dynasty. The Topkapi Palace, perched on a promontory overlooking the Bosporus, was both a residence and a symbol. Its courtyards guided visitors through layers of authority, from public spaces where foreign ambassadors were received to private chambers where decisions were whispered. The Sultan's audiences were carefully staged. Ambassadors were led past fountains and gates, greeted by officials in rich robes, until they finally stood before the ruler, seated beneath a canopy, expression calm and unreadable. Such rituals conveyed continuity, reminding all who entered that they were stepping into a centuries-old institution. Even the smallest gestures, where one stood, how one bowed, what words were spoken, were part of a script that linked the present sultan to his ancestors. The harem, so often exoticized in Western imagination, was in reality a complex social and political institution. It housed the sultan's family, wives, concubines, and female relatives, but also an entire hierarchy of attendants, tutors, and administrators. Education was central. Women were instructed in languages, music, and diplomacy. The Valid Sultan, mother of the reigning sultan, often held extraordinary influence, shaping policies and guiding alliances. During the Sultanate of Women, between the 16th and 17th centuries, figures such as Hurrem Sultan and Kuzum Sultan shaped not only palace life but also statecraft. Their letters reveal shrewd judgment, balancing generosity with firmness. To imagine the harem solely as leisure misses its reality as a training ground for politics, where power was exercised through counsel, persuasion, and patronage. Ottoman diversity also shaped their military and administration. The Devashmib system, controversial in its nature, produced loyal officials who often rose to the highest ranks. Christian families in the Balkans saw their sons taken for imperial service, yet those who advanced became viziers, generals, or administrators. This system blurred lines of identity, showing how the empire could transform outsiders into insiders. Janissaries trained from youth were disciplined, uniformed, and salaried, a departure from the feudal levies of Europe. Their marching music with drums and shrill flutes was both inspiring and intimidating. Over time, however, the Janissaries grew entrenched, resisting reform and demanding privileges until they were violently disbanded in the 19th century. Their story illustrates how institutions that first give strength can, if not reformed, become obstacles. European observers often described the empire with fascination and distortion. Renaissance travelers marveled at Istanbul's size, its baths and its mosques, but also carried back tales of despotism and decadence. The harem in particular was exaggerated into a fantasy of sensuality, reflecting Western anxieties and curiosities more than Ottoman realities. Yet admiration mingled with fear. The Ottomans were, for centuries, the other Europe, formidable at Lepanto, Vienna, and countless border skirmishes. In contrast to the hereditary aristocracies of France or Spain, the Ottomans appeared strangely meritocratic, able to elevate a shepherd's son to high office if he proved capable. This mixture of awe and unease became part of the Ottoman image in European imagination. Comparisons with other dynasties show the Ottomans' distinctiveness. The Medici ruled through wealth and art, the Habsburgs through marriage and administration, the Romanovs through autocracy and ritual. The Ottomans, however, thrived through flexibility, absorbing cultures, coexisting with religions, and using both tolerance and hierarchy to manage diversity. Their empire was not a single culture imposed on others, but a layered mosaic. A Greek Orthodox bishop, an Armenian merchant, a Kurdish herder, and a Turkish soldier could all live under the same sultan, each retaining parts of their identity while contributing to the whole. It was an empire less about assimilation than coexistence, a model that, while imperfect, allowed endurance across centuries. Ottoman art and architecture left lasting marks. Tiles from Iznik glowed in blues and whites, covering mosques and palaces with patterns that seemed infinite, evoking the order of creation. Calligraphy adorned walls and manuscripts, turning the written word into visual devotion. Miniature paintings captured courtly life in delicate detail, from hunts to festivals. Music blended Central Asian rhythms with Middle Eastern melodies, creating forms both devotional and secular. These artistic traditions were not isolated. They circulated through trade, diplomacy, and conquest, influencing and absorbing from Persian, Arab, and European neighbors. The empire was not only a political entity, but a cultural crossroads. Daily religious life gave structure across the empire. 5 times a day, the call to prayer rose from minarets, anchoring time itself. Fridays brought communal prayers, while Ramadan added nightly gatherings, breaking fast with shared meals. Sufi orders spread through towns and villages, offering mystical devotion through poetry, music, and dance. Their lodges became centers of hospitality and learning, welcoming travelers and poor alike. The Ottomans' support for Islamic institutions gave the empire cohesion, but their tolerance of Christian and Jewish practices kept diversity intact. To walk through an Ottoman city was to move through layers of belief, each with its rituals, yet bound together by a shared political order. The 19th century forced the empire into new challenges. European powers pressed at its borders, calling it the sick man of Europe, yet the Ottomans continued to adapt. The Tanzimat reforms introduced modern schools, conscription and legal equality, echoing European models. Railways stitched together provinces, telegraphs quickened communication, and newspapers carried debates to wider audiences. Still, resistance persisted. Some feared the erosion of tradition, others demanded faster change. In villages, life continued as before, but new officials arrived with ledgers and regulations, signaling that the empire was trying to keep pace with modernity. The contrast between tradition and reform gave this period its restless character. The fall of the dynasty in the early 20th century marked the end of more than 6 centuries of rule. War, debt, and nationalist movements finally proved insurmountable. Yet the Ottomans' legacy survived. The mosques of Istanbul remain among the most admired in the world. Ottoman cuisine continues to flavor modern Turkey and the Balkans, and their administrative systems influenced states long after the empire ended. They demonstrated how an empire could hold together vast diversity, not by erasing differences, but by managing them with patience, ritual, and adaptability. Their story, like the Bosporus itself, flows between worlds, between East and West, tradition and reform, tolerance and hierarchy. To reflect on the Ottomans is to see how a dynasty can endure not only by conquering, but by weaving together lives and lands, creating an empire that felt for centuries like a world entirely. In 1368, as the Yuan dynasty of the Mongols weakened under the weight of famine, rebellion, and disease, a new dynasty emerged from the heart of China. The Ming, founded by Zhu Yuanzhang, later known as the Hongwu Emperor, would rule for nearly 3 centuries. Their name, meaning brilliant, reflected both aspiration and symbolism, for they sought to restore order, dignity, and cultural identity after nearly a century of foreign domination. From the beginning, the Ming projected stability through ritual, architecture, and a revival of Confucian governance. Their dynasty became not only a political order, but a cultural statement that China was once again the center of civilization, the Middle Kingdom. The Hongwu Emperor himself came from humble origins, born into poverty, orphaned young, and once a novice in a Buddhist monastery. He rose through the ranks of rebellion against the Mongols. His victory was not only military but moral in its message. The people had restored their own rulers. Once on the throne, he ruled with both vision and severity. He strengthened the civil service examination system, which selected officials through mastery of Confucian texts, and he distrusted aristocrats who might challenge his authority. His laws were detailed, even minute, regulating farming, taxes, and military service. Life under Hongwu was disciplined, even austere, but it also brought a sense of order after years of chaos. You might imagine a farmer in the Yangtze Valley sowing rice under new regulations, knowing that grain quotas and tax obligations were now firmly set by imperial decree. Daily life under the Ming was deeply tied to agriculture. The dynasty promoted land redistribution and irrigation, ensuring fields were productive. Rice in the south, wheat in the north, and millet and sorghum elsewhere created a diverse but interconnected agricultural base. Families lived in courtyard houses, with rooms arranged around open spaces that gathered sunlight and air. Meals often included rice, vegetables, tofu, and occasionally pork or fish, depending on prosperity. Festivals punctuated the year: the Spring Festival, with lanterns and firecrackers, the Dragon Boat Festival, with races along rivers, and the Mid-Autumn Festival, with mooncakes shared under glowing skies. In villages, Confucian rituals of respect for ancestors shaped family life, reminding each generation of their place within continuity. The Ming court in Beijing, especially after the construction of the Forbidden City under the Yongle Emperor, embodied imperial authority, built with red walls, golden roofs, and vast courtyards. It was a city within a city, reserved for the emperor, his family, and officials. Each gate, hall, and pavilion was aligned according to principles of harmony, reflecting cosmic order. The emperor was regarded as the son of heaven, performing rituals at the Temple of Heaven to ensure balance between earth and sky. These ceremonies, conducted at precise times with offerings and prayers, symbolized the emperor's role as mediator of the cosmos. To imagine the Ming court is to picture processions of officials in blue robes bowing in unison, while the emperor, seated on a dragon throne, spoke little but embodied the state's sacred presence. One of the most remarkable figures of the Ming was Admiral Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch serving the Yongle Emperor. Zheng He commanded vast fleets on voyages across the Indian Ocean in the early 15th century. His ships, larger than most European vessels of the time, carried porcelain, silk, and lacquerware, and returned with spices, gems, and envoys from distant lands. They reached as far as East Africa, establishing China's presence on a global stage. These voyages were both diplomatic and symbolic. They demonstrated the grandeur of the Ming and the reach of the emperor's influence. Imagine standing on the shore of Calicut in India or Malindi in Africa, watching enormous Chinese ships glide into harbor. their red sails billowing, their decks filled with goods and envoys. For a moment, the Ming appeared poised to dominate the seas. Yet after Zheng He's voyages, the Ming turned inward. Court officials argued that resources were better spent on defending borders than on distant expeditions. Maritime restrictions were imposed, limiting trade and contact. Instead, the dynasty focused on fortifications such as the Great Wall, rebuilt and extended during this period. Its stone walls and watchtowers stretched across northern China, a visible symbol of vigilance against nomadic incursions. Farmers and soldiers alike contributed to its maintenance, and for travelers moving along the wall, its vast length impressed both with security and with the reminder of looming threats. The Ming, in choosing walls over fleets, defined their priorities: stability within rather than expansion without. Art and culture flourished under Ming patronage. Porcelain, especially the famous blue and white wares, became a hallmark of the dynasty. Traded across Asia and into Europe, literati culture thrived. Scholars painted landscapes with ink and brush, wrote poetry and compiled encyclopedias. Architecture emphasized balance and harmony, with gardens designed to mirror natural landscapes in miniature. The dynasty also sponsored woodblock printing, which spread literature more widely, from Confucian classics to novels such as Journey to the West and The Water Margin. These works, filled with adventure, humor, and moral lessons, became beloved across generations. You might picture a scholar in his study, brush in hand, copying poems by candlelight, while children outside acted out stories of Monkey King with laughter. The Ming system of governance emphasized order through bureaucracy. Officials, selected through examinations, were expected to embody Confucian virtues: honesty, diligence, and loyalty. They traveled to provincial towns, hearing disputes, collecting taxes, and ensuring imperial decrees were obeyed. Their presence linked distant villages to Beijing, making the empire feel cohesive despite its vastness. Yet bureaucracy also brought rigidity. Officials sometimes resisted innovation, clinging to precedent. This conservatism, while stabilizing, also made adaptation slower when new challenges arose. The late Ming period was marked by both cultural richness and political strain. Silver from Spanish America, flowing through Manila into China, fueled the economy but also made it dependent on global trade. As silver prices fluctuated, peasants struggled to pay taxes, corruption grew among officials, and military readiness declined. Natural disasters, floods, droughts, and famines added to unrest. Secret societies and bandit groups gained strength, while the Manchu tribes beyond the Great Wall grew in power. By the 17th century, the dynasty was weakened from within and threatened from without. In 1644, rebels entered Beijing, and the last Ming emperor hanged himself in the palace gardens. Soon after, the Manchus established the Qing dynasty, bringing the Ming era to a close. Yet the Ming legacy endures. Their architecture still defines Beijing, their porcelain remains prized, their novels continue to shape Chinese imagination. They demonstrated how order could be maintained through ritual, bureaucracy, and culture, and how a dynasty could project stability for centuries. To reflect on the Ming is to see the balance of brilliance and burden, the achievements of art and governance alongside the dangers of rigidity and inwardness. Their dynasty remains a reminder that power is not only military or economic, but also cultural, carried in stories, ceramics, and the rhythms of daily life. Daily life under the Ming was shaped by both stability and hierarchy. In the countryside where the majority of people lived, families worked in rice paddies or wheat fields, their tasks dictated by the rhythm of the seasons. Spring meant ploughing and planting, summer demanded weeding and irrigation, autumn brought harvest, and winter was a time of mending tools, weaving cloth, and gathering around fires for storytelling. Families were organized around strict hierarchies of age and gender. The eldest male typically held authority, making decisions about property, marriage, and family rituals. Ancestors were honored with offerings of food and incense, a practice that reminded each generation of their link in the long chain of continuity. You might imagine a modest ancestral shrine inside a home, red candles flickering in quiet devotion, bowls of rice and fruit set before tablets engraved with family names. Education played a special role in Ming society, particularly for boys of families with some means. Parents invested in tutors or local schools, teaching the Confucian classics, poetry, and calligraphy. Success in examinations offered a chance to rise into the bureaucracy, a dream that animated countless households. The path was long and uncertain. Thousands might sit for exams, but only a few succeeded. Families saved for years to support a son's studies, hoping he might secure a post that would bring prestige and stability. The examination halls, with rows of small cubicles where candidates wrote for days, were places of both ambition and exhaustion. For many, even failure became part of family identity, for effort itself was honorable. Urban life under the Ming offered different rhythms. Cities like Nanjing, Suzhou, and later Beijing bustled with merchants, artisans, and officials. Markets sold silks, porcelain, paper, and tea. Tea houses provided spaces for conversation, while theatres staged plays that drew audiences from all walks of life. Suzhou, famed for its gardens, became a cultural centre, where scholars and merchants alike strolled through carefully designed landscapes of rocks, ponds, and pavilions, meant to imitate natural beauty. These gardens were not merely decoration, but a form of philosophy, expressing balance between humanity and nature. In the evenings, lantern festivals illuminated streets, filling the air with laughter, music, and the glow of coloured light. Religion in Ming China was a tapestry woven of Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and folk practices. Temples stood in nearly every town, their courtyards filled with incense smoke and the murmur of prayers. Taoist rituals offered harmony with nature. Buddhist monasteries provided learning and charity, and Confucian rites emphasized social order and family duty. Popular religion often blended elements. A fisherman might pray to local river gods for safe travel, while also honoring ancestors and visiting a Buddhist temple on feast days. The state promoted Confucian orthodoxy, but local life thrived on plurality. This religious diversity allowed communities to adapt rituals to their needs, creating resilience amid uncertainty. The Great Wall, so often associated with the Ming, became more than a defensive structure. It entered myth. Stretching across mountains and deserts, rebuilt and extended with stone and brick, it embodied vigilance. Villagers near the wall sometimes labored on its construction, carrying stones and mixing mortar under the supervision of soldiers. Legends grew around its making, such as the story of Meng Jiangnu, whose tears collapsed a section of the wall after her husband died building it. Such tales reflected the human cost of imperial ambition, while also reinforcing the wall's presence as more than stone. It was a symbol of sacrifice and protection. For travelers moving along the northern frontier, the wall was both reassurance and reminder of constant threat from steppe nomads. Art under the Ming expressed both refinement and practicality. Porcelain workshops in Jingdezhen produced wares that became prized across the world. Their blue and white designs, painted with cobalt pigment, depicted landscapes, flowers, and scenes of daily life. These pieces traveled along trade routes, reaching as far as Europe, where they were treasured as exotic luxury. Painting flourished as well, especially among scholar officials who sought to express personal cultivation. They painted mountains and rivers with delicate brushwork, often inscribing poems in the margins. These works were less about realism than about mood, inviting viewers into contemplation. Music, too, was part of daily culture, from courtly ensembles playing string and wind instruments to village songs sung at festivals. Literature in the Ming era reached a remarkable flowering. Novels written in vernacular Chinese brought stories to wider audiences beyond scholars. Journey to the West, with its mischievous Monkey King, combined adventure, humor, and spiritual allegory. The Water Margin depicted outlaws banding together in loyalty and defiance, while Romance of the Three Kingdoms dramatized history into epic storytelling. These works, read aloud in tea houses or copied in printed editions, created shared cultural touchstones. Their characters and plots remain alive in Chinese imagination even today, showing how literature can carry dynastic identity across centuries. Ming cuisine reflected the empire's regional diversity. In the north, wheat-based foods like noodles and dumplings were common, while in the south, rice dominated. Street vendors sold skewers of meat, steamed buns, and sweets made with sesame or beans. Tea, already ancient in Chinese culture, became more widespread, with specialized tea houses offering refined brews. Banquets for officials and nobles featured elaborate courses, showcasing not only taste but artistry and presentation. Food culture, like art and literature, reinforced social status but also offered comfort across classes. Even a farmer sipping a bowl of hot millet porridge in winter shared in the broader culinary rhythms of the dynasty. The Ming Dynasty also interacted with the wider world in subtle ways. While official policy restricted overseas trade after Zheng He's voyages, private merchants continued to engage with Southeast Asia, Japan, and even Europeans arriving by sea. Portuguese traders reached China in the 16th century, followed by Jesuit missionaries who brought knowledge of Western astronomy and mathematics. The Jesuits, in turn, learned Chinese and translated Confucian classics into European languages. This exchange was not always smooth, but it enriched both sides. A Chinese scholar might observe Western star charts with curiosity, while a Jesuit marveled at the precision of Chinese calendars. The Ming thus stood at a global crossroads, even as they imagined themselves as self-sufficient. As the dynasty aged, contrasts sharpened. The splendor of the Forbidden City contrasted with the struggles of farmers burdened by taxes. Corruption eroded efficiency. Officials sometimes bought posts rather than earning them. Silver, once abundant, grew scarce, making tax burdens heavier. Natural disasters, floods along the Yellow River, droughts in the north exposed weaknesses. Banditry spread, and secret societies such as the White Lotus sect offered both spiritual solace and quiet resistance. In the final decades, as Manchu forces pressed at the northern borders, the empire weakened from within. The last Ming emperor, Chongzhen, left alone as allies deserted him, took his own life in 1644. His death marked both an end and a beginning, for the Qing would inherit and reshape what the Ming had built. The Ming dynasty's memory endures not as tragedy, but as a symbol of brilliance. Their porcelain still gleams in museums worldwide, their novels are still read, their palaces still stand in Beijing. They represented an ideal of order, achieved through ritual, bureaucracy, and cultural flourishing. Yet their story also reminds us of fragility, that even dynasties rooted in brilliance can falter if they grow rigid or fail to adapt to changing times. The Ming remain guardians in memory, their dynasty a bridge between medieval and early modern China, between isolation and global contact, between discipline and creativity. In the late 15th century, England was weary from decades of civil war. The Wars of the Roses had pitted rival branches of the royal family against each other, leaving fields stained with blood and noble houses thinned by death. From this turbulence emerged a new dynasty, the Tudors, who would not only restore stability, but redefine England's place in the world. Their reign, though relatively short at just over a century, reshaped religion, governance and culture in ways that would echo far beyond their lifetimes. The Tudors demonstrate how even a brief dynasty can leave a legacy that stretches across centuries. Henry VII, the founder of the line, ascended the throne in 1485 after defeating Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. His victory ended the civil wars and began a process of cautious consolidation. Henry's approach was pragmatic. He strengthened royal finances, curbed the independence of powerful nobles, and built alliances through marriage. His reign was not flamboyant but steady, like a craftsman smoothing rough timber after storm damage. Under his cautious guidance, the monarchy became stronger, preparing the way for his more famous descendants. You might imagine him seated in council, his gaze sharp, his words few, carefully weighing coins and contract with equal seriousness. Henry VIII, his son, transformed the monarchy into something far more assertive. Known for his 6 marriages and his break with the Catholic Church, Henry embodied both majesty and contradiction. His early reign was marked by athleticism and pageantry, jousts, banquets, and music, yet his decisions reshaped the very structure of English life. In his quest for a male heir, he broke from Rome, establishing the Church of England with the monarch as its head. Monasteries were dissolved, their lands redistributed, altering the landscape of villages and towns. For ordinary people, the change meant more than doctrine. It altered daily routines, parish life, and local economies. Fields once tended by monks were turned to other uses, and churches lost relics and shrines that had long been centers of devotion. Henry's reign reveals how dynastic concerns, the need for heirs, could ripple outward into profound cultural shifts. His daughter Elizabeth I, known as the Virgin Queen, brought the Tudor era to its zenith. She inherited a kingdom divided by religion and threatened by powerful rivals, yet she ruled with a mixture of caution and charisma. Her court became a stage where loyalty and spectacle intertwined. Courtiers wore rich garments of velvet and lace, competed in poetry, and performed elaborate dances. Elizabeth herself, with her painted face and jeweled gowns, cultivated an image of majesty that transcended her gender in a patriarchal world. Under her, England defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, secured Protestant identity, and encouraged exploration that would lay the seeds of the empire. Yet her daily governance was marked not only by grand victories, but by patient negotiation, balancing factions, and preserving unity in a divided land. Life under the Tudors was not limited to courts and palaces. For ordinary people, it was a time of gradual change. The dissolution of monasteries altered local communities, but parish churches remained central. Markets bustled with wool, grain, and fish. Homes were timber-framed, with thatched roofs in villages and tiled roofs in towns. Diets were simple: bread, ale, pottage, with meat more common among the better off. Festivals filled the year: May Day with its dances around the maypole, harvest feasts in autumn, and Christmas with carols and communal meals. Education expanded, with grammar schools and universities producing a new class of literate men, some of whom would contribute to England's literary flowering. The world of Shakespeare emerged in this context, reflecting both the grandeur of court and the humour of common taverns. The Tudor dynasty ended with Elizabeth, who left no heir, yet their influence persisted. The crown passed to the Stuarts, uniting England and Scotland under one monarch. This union, though often tense, laid foundations for the eventual United Kingdom. The Stuarts faced new challenges: civil war, regicide, and restoration. The execution of Charles I in 1649 revealed how far the balance of power had shifted. Monarchy was no longer unquestioned. Though the Stuarts returned, they never regained the absolute authority of earlier times. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 established constitutional monarchy, binding royal power within parliamentary limits. What began as Tudor consolidation ended as a monarchy transformed, still symbolic, but increasingly bound to institutions and law. The British monarchy of later centuries carried the legacy further, presiding over the expansion of the empire. The Hanoverians oversaw industrialization and colonial growth. Queen Victoria, in the 19th century, gave her name to an age when Britain stood as a global power, its navy commanding seas, its colonies spanning continents. Yet, even in grandeur, the monarchy evolved into a symbol more than a ruler, embodying continuity amid change. Daily life for Britons transformed during this time. Factories replaced fields, railways crisscrossed the land, and cities swelled with workers. The monarchy, while less politically powerful, remained a steady presence, adapting rituals and appearances to remain relevant. Ritual has always been central to Britain's monarchy. Coronations in Westminster Abbey, with their oaths, anointing and crowning, connect rulers to centuries of tradition. Trooping the colour, royal weddings, and public appearances foster a sense of shared identity. Even as political power shifted to Parliament, the monarchy retained cultural authority through ceremony. The Tudors mastered this early, with Elizabeth's progresses through the countryside and Henry VIII's elaborate pageantry. Later monarchs inherited the lesson that power often lies in perception, and continuity can be sustained through ritual even when substance has changed. In comparing Britain's monarchy with others, its endurance stands out. The Medici faded, the Romanovs fell, the Ottomans were abolished, yet Britain's monarchy persisted, transforming itself to survive. Its adaptability, perhaps learned in the Tudor age, became its defining strength. By ceding political authority while preserving cultural role, the monarchy ensured its survival. Today, the crown remains a symbol not of absolute power, but of continuity, linking present with past in ceremonies watched across the world. The Tudor and subsequent royal houses demonstrate how dynasties can shape not only politics but identity. They redefined religion, strengthened state structures, encouraged exploration, and fostered culture. Their legacy endures not just in palaces and portraits, but in institutions, literature, and the very sense of Britain as a kingdom woven from continuity and change. To reflect on them is to sense both drama and quiet endurance, a dynasty that turned conflict into stability and left behind a monarchy that still, centuries later, commands attention. Court life during the Tudor era was a theatre of power. Henry VIII, with his towering figure and love of spectacle, turned the court into a place where loyalty was displayed through pageantry. Banquets featured entire roasted animals, elaborately spiced and gilded with gold leaf. Musicians played lutes and recorders, while courtiers performed masks, dances, and plays in which allegories of loyalty and virtue were enacted for the king. Clothing became a statement of allegiance. Velvet, brocade, and furs were worn by those near the monarch, while laws on sumptuary dress restricted commoners from imitating elite fashion. The court was not merely a residence but a performance, where every gesture was laden with meaning. You might imagine a hall filled with torchlight, jewels glinting, and the murmurs of courtiers weighing each word, knowing a misstep could bring ruin. Henry VIII's break with Rome created not only religious transformation but daily disruption. Parish churches lost relics and shrines that had been venerated for centuries. Pilgrimages were discouraged, monasteries dissolved, and their lands transferred to nobles or the crown. For peasants, this meant changes in local charity. Monasteries had often provided alms, food, and medical care, and their absence was keenly felt. Some churches retained vestiges of old devotion, while others embraced the new Protestant liturgy with English prayers and simpler decoration. The Reformation was not an abstract policy, but a tangible shift in village life, altering prayers, rituals, and even the artwork on church walls. The quiet grief of an elderly villager seeing a favourite shrine removed tells us as much about the Tudor legacy as royal decrees do. Elizabeth I understood the power of image perhaps better than any Tudor. She presented herself as the Virgin Queen, wedded not to a man but to her people. Her portraits, carefully controlled, showed her as ageless, adorned with pearls, symbols of purity, and surrounded by allegories of wisdom and power. She conducted royal progresses through the countryside, staying in the homes of nobles, where feasts and entertainments honoured her. For villagers, glimpsing the Queen was a moment of awe, her presence embodying majesty in flesh and fabric. Yet she ruled not only through spectacle, but through shrewd balancing, avoiding entangling marriages and wars that could weaken her fragile kingdom. Her reign was one of survival as much as triumph, a steady navigation through storms. Elizabethan culture flourished, reflecting the tensions and hopes of the time. The theatre reached new heights with writers such as William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Ben Jonson. Their plays captured the grandeur of kings, the humour of peasants, and the ambiguities of power. Performances at the Globe Theatre drew audiences from all classes, from apprentices standing in the pit to nobles seated in galleries. Music too flourished, with composers like Thomas Tallis and William Byrd creating sacred and secular works that blended tradition with innovation. Literature, art, and exploration all carried the imprint of a society that felt itself on the edge of greatness, poised between old medieval certainties and new horizons of modernity. Daily life for common people under the Tudors remained simple but slowly changed. Houses were timber-framed with wattle and daub walls, their interiors smoky from open hearths. Families slept in shared spaces, often with straw mattresses covered in coarse cloth. Meals were plain: bread, ale, pottage of grains and vegetables, with meat reserved for festivals. Markets provided opportunities to buy and sell, and fairs brought entertainment with jugglers, musicians, and merchants. Education spread slowly, with grammar schools founded in many towns. Literacy increased, not only among elites but also among merchants and artisans, allowing broader participation in cultural life. For most, the monarchy was distant, glimpsed only in proclamations read aloud in market squares or in the rare sight of royal progresses. Yet the Tudors' decisions shaped even the humblest cottages, whether through taxes, religion, or trade. The Tudors also carried with them myths and legends. Henry VIII's 6 wives became subjects of fascination, their fates seen as both tragedy and warning. Divorced, beheaded, died; divorced, beheaded, survived, became a rhyme remembered by later generations. Stories of Anne Boleyn's rise and fall, of Jane Seymour's death after childbirth, and of Catherine Parr's survival fed a narrative of danger around the throne. Elizabeth's virginity became mythologized, her refusal to marry transformed into a symbol of devotion to her country. These legends remind us that dynasties are remembered not only for policies but for stories that capture imagination. The Tudors, with their drama and spectacle, ensured their memory would remain vivid. Comparisons with continental monarchies highlight the Tudors' distinctiveness. In France, the Valois and later the Bourbons built centralized states with strong Catholic identity. In Spain, the Habsburgs wielded vast global power fueled by New World silver. The Tudors, in contrast, ruled a smaller kingdom, but leveraged religion, image, and naval strength to punch above their weight. Their navy's defeat of the Spanish Armada symbolized a shift. England was no longer a peripheral power, but an emerging force. Unlike the Ottoman Sultans, who governed through religious pluralism, the Tudors insisted on uniformity of faith, shaping English identity around Protestantism. Each dynasty reveals different strategies for survival, and the Tudors demonstrate how drama, reform, and careful imagery could sustain power in a volatile age. As the dynasty gave way to the Stuarts, the foundations laid by the Tudors endured. The Church of England remained, defining national identity. Parliament, though still limited, had grown in importance, setting the stage for future struggles. Exploration begun under Elizabeth blossomed into empire under later monarchs. Culturally, the flowering of literature, music, and theatre continued to inspire. The Tudors remind us that dynasties need not be long-lived to be influential. Their century of rule left marks that shaped Britain for centuries. In the centuries that followed, the British monarchy continued to adapt. The Stuarts faced civil war, the Hanoverians presided over empire and industrial revolution, and Queen Victoria gave her name to an age of confidence and expansion. The Tudors, however, remain a touchstone, their portraits and palaces evoking a time when monarchy was both fragile and flamboyant, threatened yet triumphant. Their legacy lives in both history and imagination, in plays and novels, in the enduring fascination with Henry's wives and Elizabeth's image. The monarchy's survival in Britain, unlike the fate of Romanovs or Ottomans, rests partly on this Tudor adaptability. They taught later monarchs that ceremony, culture, and image can sustain continuity even when political power shifts. Today, coronations and jubilees echo Tudor pageantry, adapted for modern audiences but rooted in centuries-old traditions. To reflect on the Tudors is to glimpse both transformation and continuity, a dynasty that bridged medieval uncertainty and modern confidence, leaving behind a monarchy that still endures. In the late 18th century, in the Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt, a family began to build a legacy that would extend across Europe and beyond. Mayer Amschel Rothschild, born in 1744, started modestly, dealing in coins, antiques, and financial services. From these beginnings, he established a banking house that would expand into an international network, with branches in Frankfurt, Vienna, London, Paris, and Naples. Unlike monarchs or conquerors, the Rothschilds built their dynasty not on land or armies, but on credit, information, and trust. Their influence demonstrates how in the modern age, wealth and networks could shape history as profoundly as crowns and battles. Daily life in Frankfurt's ghetto was modest. Families lived in narrow houses, their windows barred, their freedoms restricted by laws. Jews faced limitations on where they could live, what professions they could pursue, and how they could participate in society. Yet, within these boundaries, communities built resilience. Synagogues provided spiritual anchor, markets thrived within their walls, and family connections offered support. Mayer Amschel grew up in this world, where discipline, thrift, and ingenuity were necessities. His early training in finance came from apprenticing with merchants, handling coins and accounting. You might imagine him as a young man, carefully inspecting old coins, learning not only their value but their histories, understanding that money was more than metal, it was trust embodied. Mayer's vision extended beyond local trade. He recognized that Europe's rulers needed credit to wage wars, fund armies, and build states. By offering loans, managing funds, and supplying governments, he entered a sphere where finance met politics. His genius was to expand through his 5 sons, each of whom established a branch of the family business in a different European capital. This network allowed the Rothschilds to move money quickly, to share information faster than official channels, and to weather crises by pooling resources. In an age before telegraphs, their couriers carried letters across borders, often arriving before news in newspapers. Their advantage was not only wealth but information. Nathan Rothschild in London became particularly influential. During the Napoleonic Wars, he financed British efforts, arranging supplies and loans. After the Battle of Waterloo, legend has it that he used early knowledge of the outcome to profit on the stock exchange, though the story has often been exaggerated. What mattered was that his family's network allowed Britain to fund its wars more effectively. Governments began to rely on Rothschild credit, recognizing that financial stability was as crucial as military success. You might imagine ministers in London or Paris meeting quietly with Rothschild agents, discussing terms late into the night, knowing that armies in the field depended on agreements made in candlelit offices. The Rothschilds also transformed daily finance. They introduced bonds as a common tool for raising funds, helping states secure credit from investors. This practice spread across Europe, linking citizens' savings with national projects. A merchant in Hamburg, a farmer in Provence, or a craftsman in Vienna might find his modest investments tied to government loans arranged by the Rothschilds. In this way, they connected ordinary people to the machinery of states, making finance a bridge between rulers and ruled. The family's name became associated with reliability, a rare commodity in a time when governments often defaulted or currencies wavered. Their influence extended into infrastructure. The Rothschilds financed railways, mines, and industries, fueling Europe's industrial expansion. Tracks laid across England, tunnels carved through Alps, and banks established in cities bore their imprint. By supporting railways, they reshaped daily life. Journeys that once took days now took hours, and goods flowed more quickly to markets. The Rothschilds understood that investing in such projects not only brought profit, but also tied their fortune to the progress of nations. In this sense, they were architects of modernity, helping to construct the skeleton of the industrial world. Despite their prominence, the Rothschilds cultivated discretion. They avoided political office, preferring influence behind the scenes. Their wealth was displayed in private palaces, art collections, and gardens, yet they rarely sought public adulation. This discretion was strategic. Visible power attracts resentment. Indeed, myths and conspiracies soon surrounded them, exaggerating their influence into near supernatural control. Stories spread of Rothschild dominance over entire governments, tales that mixed awe with anti-Semitism. These myths obscured the reality. They were powerful, yes, but their power was rooted in networks, not in omnipotence. To reflect on their story is to recognize how financial dynasties can be both indispensable and misunderstood. Daily life for the Rothschild families reflected both tradition and adaptation. They maintained Jewish rituals, supported synagogues, and upheld family loyalty. At the same time, they moved in aristocratic circles, hosting gatherings with music, fine dining, and art. Their homes became centers of culture, where paintings by masters hung on walls and orchestras played in salons. Gardens, especially in England and France, became renowned for their beauty, filled with rare plants collected from around the world. In this blending of tradition and modernity, they mirrored the societies they influenced, rooted in heritage, yet constantly adapting. Their philanthropic efforts were another aspect of their legacy. They funded hospitals, schools, and charities, supporting both Jewish communities and broader society. In Vienna, Paris, and London, their contributions improved public health, education, and culture. By using wealth for public benefit, they reinforced their legitimacy and softened resentment. These acts also reveal how dynasties can shape society, not only through politics or finance, but through generosity that leaves lasting marks. The Rothschilds' story also illustrates how power can survive without crowns. Unlike the Tudors or Habsburgs, they did not inherit thrones, yet they shaped nations. Their network, built on trust, information, and discretion, outlasted wars, revolutions, and regime changes. When monarchies fell, Rothschild banks often remained. Their continuity demonstrates a new form of dynasty, one suited to the modern world, flexible, adaptive, and less tied to visible symbols of sovereignty. Even today, the Rothschild name evokes both admiration and myth. Their banks have changed, merged, and adapted, but their legacy as pioneers of modern finance endures. They remind us that power can be invisible, moving through contracts and bonds as much as through armies and palaces. Their dynasty shows how influence in the modern age often lies not in spectacle but in subtlety, not in visible crowns but in the quiet authority of trust. To reflect on the Rothschilds is to see how families can shape history through finance, how networks can bind nations as firmly as walls, and how discretion can preserve continuity where ostentation might invite downfall. Their legacy stands alongside monarchs and emperors, proving that dynasties need not rule kingdoms to shape them. The 5 sons of Mayer Amschel Rothschild became the pillars of the dynasty. Amschel Mayer remained in Frankfurt to manage the original house. Salomon established himself in Vienna, working closely with the Habsburg court. Nathan went to London, where he became the most influential of the brothers. Karl settled in Naples, extending the family's reach into Italy. James made Paris his base, where he became a fixture in French finance. Together, they created a network that spanned the heart of Europe. Each brother managed his branch but maintained loyalty to the family as a whole. They corresponded constantly, sharing information, credit, and strategy. Their motto could well have been unity, for they understood that together they were stronger than any one of them could be alone. Nathan in London became perhaps the most legendary, known for his sharp wit, boldness, and mastery of the stock exchange. He built the London house into the family's most powerful arm. He financed British military campaigns, facilitated government borrowing, and invested in infrastructure. Stories circulated about his nerve, that he once seized control of a critical bond issue by offering lower interest than anyone else, confident that the family's reputation would ensure trust. In London, his influence was felt not only in government offices but in markets, where his actions could sway sentiment. To picture Nathan is to imagine a man in a dark coat and hat, walking briskly through the city, his presence enough to shift whispers into certainty. James in Paris, known as James de Rothschild, became equally influential. He financed railways that stitched together France, transforming travel and commerce. His home became a centre of culture, hosting salons where artists, writers, and politicians mingled. Balzac described him in novels, and Chopin played at his gatherings. James's philanthropy included hospitals, schools, and support for the arts, which softened criticism of his immense wealth. In France, where revolution and suspicion of finance ran deep, James managed to maintain prestige by combining business acumen with cultural patronage. His life illustrates how the Rothschilds balanced discretion with visibility, influence with generosity. Salomon in Vienna managed relations with the Habsburg Empire. His loans helped sustain Austria through wars and fiscal difficulties. In return, he was granted privileges, though as a Jew, he still faced social barriers. His position in Vienna demonstrates the paradox of the Rothschilds, indispensable to governments, yet often outsiders in aristocratic circles. Still, their financial power ensured they could not be ignored. Salomon's children later received noble titles, symbolizing how wealth could gradually open doors that tradition had closed. Karl in Naples extended the family's reach into Italy. Though less prominent than his brothers in London or Paris, his branch helped finance Bourbon rulers and supported infrastructure. His presence in Naples highlights the family's strategy to establish themselves in multiple centers of power, ensuring that no single political upheaval could uproot them. When revolutions shook Italy in the 19th century, Karl's descendants adapted, closing some ventures but preserving the family's presence. Amschelmeyer, who remained in Frankfurt, served as the elder statesman. He maintained the original house, coordinated between brothers, and represented continuity with their father's legacy. Though less flamboyant, his role was essential, for he provided stability at the family's heart. The brothers' correspondence often flowed through him, making Frankfurt not only the origin, but also the anchor of the dynasty. The Rothschilds played crucial roles during Europe's upheavals. During the Napoleonic Wars, their financing allowed Britain and its allies to sustain campaigns. Later, during the revolutions of 1848, their loyalty to governments made them targets of suspicion. In Paris, crowds at times muttered against them, associating wealth with repression. Yet they survived, partly because their financial stability was indispensable, and partly because they avoided direct political entanglement. They learned to endure criticism, knowing that governments would always return to them when funds were needed. Myths and conspiracy theories grew around them. One enduring tale held that Nathan Rothschild used advance news of Waterloo to manipulate markets, making a fortune. The story exaggerated his actions, but it captured imagination, the idea of a man who could turn the fate of nations into profit. Over time, these myths expanded into claims of secret control, often infused with anti-Semitic suspicion. The Rothschilds became symbols in narratives about hidden power, their real influence magnified into fantasy. To reflect on these myths is to see how wealth can inspire both admiration and resentment, and how discretion, while preserving privacy, can also invite speculation. Inside their households, life blended tradition with modern luxury. The Rothschilds maintained Jewish rituals, hosting Passover seders and supporting synagogues. At the same time, their homes were filled with European art, music, and cuisine. Their gardens became famous. In England, the Rothschild estates featured rare plants and elaborate designs, combining horticultural science with beauty. Art collections filled galleries, with paintings by Rembrandt, Raphael, and Turner. Family dinners could include both Hebrew blessings and French cuisine, reflecting their dual identity as both Jews and European elites. Their homes were microcosms of their world, rooted in heritage, yet engaged with modernity. Their philanthropy extended beyond their own communities. In London, they funded schools and hospitals. In Paris, they supported art and public works. In Vienna, they contributed to welfare institutions. They believed that wealth carried obligations, not only to family but to society. This philanthropy was practical as well as generous, for it reinforced their social legitimacy. By funding public projects, they countered criticism that they profited without giving back. Their example shows how dynasties can sustain themselves not only by accumulating, but by redistributing, turning wealth into trust. In comparing the Rothschilds with older dynasties, contrasts emerge. The Medici rose through banking, but tied themselves to politics, ruling Florence directly. The Habsburgs built their empire through marriage, the Romanovs through autocracy, the Ottomans through conquest, the Ming through bureaucracy, and the Tudors through religion and image. The Rothschilds, by contrast, chose invisibility. They held no thrones, wore no crowns, commanded no armies. Their power was subtler, flowing through contracts, networks, and credit. In this, they represent the shift of modern history, from rule by force to influence through finance. Their dynasty reveals how, in the modern age, power can be quiet yet decisive. Even in decline, their legacy endures. While no longer commanding the financial dominance of the 19th century, Rothschild banks and ventures continue. Their estates, collections, and charities remain part of cultural life. Their name, though entangled in myth, still evokes both wealth and discretion. To think of the Rothschilds is to see a dynasty unlike any other in this series. Not royal, not imperial, but nonetheless formative. They demonstrate how families can shape history, not only by ruling states, but by financing them, not only by conquering, but by underwriting conquest. Their story concludes this exploration of powerful families, from Florence to Vienna, from Moscow to Istanbul, from Beijing to London. Dynasties have shaped history through art, marriage, war, ritual, and finance. The Rothschilds remind us that in the modern age, crowns may fade but influence persists, often in quieter forms. To reflect on them is to sense the invisible threads that connect wealth, trust, and power. Threads woven not in palaces but in ledgers, not in ceremonies but in networks. Their dynasty shows us that history is not only shaped by those who sit on thrones, but also by those who stand behind them, calculating, advising, and sustaining.